there. So a lot of these organisms were actually found really close to campus. So we both live in Pollock, so it was really easy to actually find a lot of organisms. A lot of our plants and stuff like that were found by the Pollock Commons and like the little bushy areas around the halls. And a lot of animals were found by South Halls and obviously the Arboretum. So the first organism that we have is actually the eastern cottontail. An interesting adaptation they have is that they can actually eat really unusual foods. So basically they can eat anything green. Like every month except winter, they can eat anything green, which includes poison ivy. But in the winter, when there's actually not that much viable green stuff, they'll eat a lot of wood. So they'll eat bark, twigs, and a lot of buds during the winter. Um, they can live either in woody or like big fields. Obviously around here, like they're obviously they're not by Beaver Stadium, they're not by major roads, but you see them a lot in the woody areas and kind of like the bushes and the grass areas by the dorms. So these bunnies actually have two types of poop. One poop's kind of like the regular poop that every organism does, and the other type of poop is actually one that they poop and then they re-eat the poop in order to get as much nutrients as possible. Something that humans need to be really careful of is that they actually like really love hunting these animals. Hunting animals has become a sport, especially for their meat and their fur. The next species we had was closer to the Arboretum, actually. So this is actually a really interesting species of breed. They actually got their name because when they're caterpillars, they feed on a bunch of different types of cabbage, and that can include green and red cabbage, Brussels sprouts, bok choy, and even kale. And one thing that makes them really adaptable to live in most environments is that most environments where you have organisms like these have sun. So their wings actually take in solar energy. And because of the V shape on their wings, they're able to absorb that heat and in turn use that for energy to fly. And so they're actually very native to Asia, and they came over to Europe via the Silk Road. Actually, in the Columbian Exchange, there's a population that was accidentally taken over to Canada. And since then, they have traveled all over North America and more specifically the Penn State Arboretum. And they're pretty significant to humans. So they're not poisonous themselves, but they do cause a lot of cabbage white damage is what they call it. So farmers have a huge problem with them, and it does affect our food because they take our food, which is obviously a really big concern. Our next species was the hydrangea, which was right outside of Pollock Commons. These hydrangea actually reproduce sexually. Their pollen is scattered in the form of male and female gametes, and it's scattered by the wind. So this is kind of like a problem because if weather conditions aren't exactly the best, then there's not really an issue. And this is overall like a good example that hydrangeas are actually really submissive to their environment. Like if there's not a lot of wind, then they obviously can't reproduce as well. And also the color of hydrangeas, like hydrangeas are obviously very popular. A lot of people use them to plant and stuff. So the color of hydrangeas is actually determined by the pH in the soil, and the pH in the soil. So if the pH is more acidic, then you'll have more aluminum ions, and aluminum ions contribute to what makes the color in these hydrangeas. So obviously in Pollock Commons, there's a little bit of acidity in the soil, but not enough to make them bluish like high pH soils would be. So an advantage of these plants, they are heavily influenced by the environment, but as long as they get a few hours of sunlight a day, they will flower, which is obviously really significant. As I said, they're very popular to humans, and obviously they'll be fine with just a few hours of sunlight, which is good for survival. And hydrangea plants have actually been on Earth longer than humans, and there's kind of like there's pros and cons to them. Obviously, they're very pretty for aesthetics, but unfortunately, we did not coexist with them. So their leaves are actually very poisonous to ingest as humans. But the hydrangea root is actually used as an antioxidant that people put into cosmetic and medical products. And surprisingly, it's also used to treat kidney problems. This green algae was found at the Arboretum, and algae are very closely related to bacteria. They actually transformed and took up bacterial genes a long time ago. which allows them to survive really harsh environments. And scientists actually predict that they will be able to withstand climate change, no matter how good or bad it may become. This type of algae actually reproduces asexually, since it's sort of like a smaller version. They reproduce via binary fission, which is also like another example of how it transforms bacteria. And it actually proved to be a really big advantage. So algae like this can actually double in size in like a little less than 24 hours. So that little spot you see there on the bottom left corner, that could be twice the size in one day, which is actually kind of insane for like the size of this. Um, so I mean, it's not really that beneficial to humans. Like obviously other algae like seaweed are very like nutrient healthy to like humans, but green pond algae, that's more helpful for like the overall health and contribute to longevity of the ecosystem and small water bodies like this. So I mean, this algae like this is used to put on golf courses, petting zoos, and even just like backyard ponds. Scientists have raised concerns about the lack of sunlight getting through to organisms that live below, but they weighed that with the pros that the organisms actually eat the algae. So while they can reproduce really quickly, smaller animals like minnows and zooplankton actually do eat the green algae. And the green pond algae is very closely related to plants, so it does use photosynthesis. Their production of oxygen provides like overall water clarity and like better living and breathing conditions for all the organisms that do live in these plants. This next organism was found near the Arboretum. The Lepiota cristata is also known as the stinking dapperling, one of the mushrooms that's found near State College. So one of the first things about these organisms is that they do actually reproduce sexually. They produce spores, which come out of slits that is in the mushroom's cap, and that in the cap acts as a fruiting structure. So that's how they reproduce spores. They are saprobes, which means they do feed off of decaying and dead organic matter. So they feed off of other dead organisms in the ground or in the soil, or even other mushrooms that might be dead. And they're able to like take up those nutrients and contribute to the nitrogen cycle. So these were originally made in Europe. A lot of people, they're mostly popular in Britain and Ireland. And many people in Europe do eat these as a delectable, but it does really worry scientists and dietitians, because if not taken care of correctly, these mushrooms can actually be really poisonous. So it's really important to humans that we know the correct ways to help handle these organisms, the right way to cook them, the right way to serve them. And these mushrooms actually have their name for a reason. One of their advantages is actually their smell. So they do have a rubber or a coal gas smell, which you'll probably smell if you're near there or near the Arboretum. This is used to ward off potential predators, because obviously you're not going to want to eat something if it smells bad. So that's one of the advantages that they have.
So while going through and researching the different organisms that we discovered along campus, the one that popped out to me the most was the algae that we found out by the Arboretum. So my question was whether or not the algae population would determine an effect on the ecosystem. So with that, I made a hypothesis of if an extreme increase or decrease in the population of algae would have a negative effect on the ecosystem. So with this, I decided that the best experiment would be to put these into 3 different ecosystems of different populations. So with this, I decided to do the first ecosystem with one that would be a stable, more natural to what it would be like in real life, of having not too much, but not too little algae. The second ecosystem I decided would be to overpopulate an ecosystem and see what the effect would be if you have too much algae. And the third ecosystem would be that of an underpopulation algae to little to zero algae in the ecosystem. To see the effect of how the population of algae would affect, I would compare each ecosystem and see how the other organisms in each ecosystem compare to each other, and if one did better and served the ecosystem better than the other. Next slide. So one of the articles that I looked at was on harmful algal blooms, and this relates to my hypothesis because I want to look at overpopulation, what the effect would be on the ecosystems that it had, and this went into a detail of what causes these harmful algal blooms to occur, as seen in the figure to the right, in which they talk about how increasing population of humans has been causing these one of the many causes of algal blooms to occur, in which like these overpopulations are providing pollutants and other factors that cause nutrients to get into these areas where these algae are living, and they cause, when these algae receive the nutrients, it causes these algae blooms to occur, increasing their population. And from there, we can see the effect that these algae blooms have on these different ecosystems. So in some areas, these algae blooms are very helpful, as seen in China, where the increased algae production provides more nutrients to fishes and aquatic life there, which in turn they